The daily diet of the Civil War soldier stands as one of the most thoroughly documented, yet widely misunderstood aspects of the American conflict that raged from 1861 to 1865. Through examination of military records, soldiers' letters and diaries, quartermaster reports, and archaeological evidence from campsites and battlefields, historians have assembled a detailed picture of what these men actually consumed during their years of service. The reality of Civil War military nutrition reveals a complex story of bureaucratic planning, logistical challenges, regional differences, and the constant struggle between official policy and actual practice that shaped the daily lives of more than 3 million men who wore either blue or gray uniforms. At the outbreak of war in April 1861, both the United States and the newly formed Confederate States approached military provisioning with established theories inherited from earlier conflicts, particularly the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 and European military practices. The United States Army entered the war with regulations that specified daily ration allowances for each soldier, quantities that had been calculated by military planners to provide adequate nutrition for men engaged in active campaigning. According to official Union Army regulations revised in 1861, each soldier was entitled to receive daily rations consisting of 12 ounces of pork or bacon, or 1 pound and 4 ounces of fresh or salt beef. Additionally, the prescribed ration included 1 pound and 6 ounces of soft bread or flour, or 1 pound of hard bread, which would become universally known as hardtack. The ration further specified beans or peas at a rate of 1 pound and 6 ounces per 100 rations, rice or hominy at the same proportion, and coffee at 1 pound and 4 ounces per 100 rations. Sugar was allocated at 2 pounds and 8 ounces per 100 rations, while vinegar and candles received smaller allotments. Salt was provided at the rate of 3 pounds and 12 ounces per 100 rations. This official ration, when fully issued, theoretically provided soldiers with approximately 3,000 to 3,500 calories daily, a quantity military planners considered sufficient for men engaged in the physical demands of military service. The Confederate Army, lacking the established bureaucratic infrastructure of the United States military, initially relied heavily on state-level provisioning before developing a centralized commissary department. Confederate ration regulations, formalized in 1861, closely mirrored Union specifications, with some variations. The official Confederate daily ration called for 1 1/4 pounds of beef, or 3/4 of a pound of pork or bacon. Flour or meal was provided at 1 1/4 pounds, or 1 pound of hard bread. Confederate regulations also included peas or beans, rice, sugar, coffee, and salt, in proportions similar to Union allowances. However, as historians have extensively documented, the actual implementation of these official rations diverged dramatically from written policy, particularly as the war progressed and the Confederate supply system faced mounting challenges. Hardtack, the ubiquitous staple that became synonymous with Civil War soldier life, deserves particular attention for its central role in military diet. This simple biscuit, manufactured from flour, water, and salt, was baked without leavening into squares approximately 3 inches by 3 inches and roughly half an inch thick. The name hardtack derived from the British sailors' term for similar ship's biscuit, though soldiers employed numerous colorful alternative names, including sheet iron crackers, teeth dullers, and worm castles, the latter referring to the unfortunate tendency of hardtack to become infested with weevils during storage. The manufacturing process involved mixing flour with minimal water to create a stiff dough, which was then cut into squares, pierced with holes to prevent expansion during baking, and baked at relatively low temperatures until completely dried. This thorough desiccation served the crucial military purpose of creating a bread product that could be stored for extended periods without spoiling, transported in bulk without special handling, and issued to troops in the field without requiring fresh baking facilities. Union hardtack production centered in several large government bakeries and contracted civilian facilities, with the most significant operations located in New York City and other northeastern urban centers. These facilities operated on industrial scales, producing hundreds of thousands of hardtack crackers daily. Records indicate that by 1863, northern bakeries had streamlined production to remarkable efficiency, with some facilities capable of producing more than 100,000 pounds of hardtack per day. The crackers were packed into wooden crates, holding approximately 50 pounds each, and these crates were shipped via rail and wagon to army depots, then distributed through the supply chain to individual regiments. The Union supply system, while imperfect, generally maintained sufficient hardtack production throughout the war, though distribution to frontline units often proved problematic during active campaigns. Confederate hardtack production faced considerably greater challenges. The South lacked the industrial bakery infrastructure of the North and struggled with flour shortages as the war disrupted agricultural production and Union forces captured territory. Confederate commissary departments established bakeries in major cities, including Richmond, Atlanta, and Wilmington, but production never matched Union levels. Confederate hardtack quality varied considerably, and shortages became increasingly common as the war progressed. By 1864, many Confederate units received hardtack only irregularly, and the crackers they did receive were often of inferior quality, sometimes made with cornmeal rather than wheat flour, when wheat became unavailable. The actual consumption of hardtack in camp and field illustrates the gap between official rations and soldier experience. Hardtack in pristine condition presented a formidable challenge to human teeth, being genuinely hard enough to resist casual biting. Soldiers developed various techniques for rendering hardtack edible. The most common method involved soaking the crackers in coffee, which softened them sufficiently for consumption. Alternatively, soldiers would crumble hardtack into soups or stews, where the liquid similarly softened the pieces. A popular preparation involved frying hardtack in bacon grease, creating a dish soldiers called skilly galley. More elaborate was a concoction known as lobscouse, which combined crumbled hardtack with salt pork or beef, potatoes when available, and onions, all stewed together into a thick mixture. When hardtack became infested with weevils, as frequently occurred during warm weather storage, soldiers faced the unpleasant choice of picking out the insects, which proved time-consuming and often incomplete, or simply consuming the protein-enhanced crackers after tapping them against a hard surface to dislodge the most visible pests. Soldiers' letters and diaries reveal that many eventually adopted a pragmatic approach, eating the infested hardtack after dark when the weevils could not be seen, a practice that became grimly routine. Salt pork and bacon constituted the primary protein source for soldiers on both sides, and the military procurement and distribution of these preserved meats represented one of the largest logistical undertakings of the war. Pork preservation through salt curing was well-established technology in mid-19th century America, and both governments relied heavily on contracted civilian packing houses, primarily located in the Midwest. Cincinnati, known as Porkopolis, served as the center of northern pork processing, with other significant operations in Chicago and Milwaukee. The standard military salt pork came from hog bellies that had been packed in barrels with coarse salt, a process that drew moisture from the meat and created an environment hostile to bacterial growth. Bacon, which came from the same cut but underwent smoking in addition to salting, was considered preferable by soldiers for its superior flavor, though both pork products required desalting before cooking. The preparation of salt pork in camp followed a generally consistent process across both armies. Soldiers would receive their pork ration, typically a slab of fatty meat with minimal lean portions, which they would then slice and either fry in skillets over campfires or boil in water to remove excess salt. The rendered fat from frying salt pork served multiple culinary purposes, being used to fry hardtack, flavor beans, or supplement other dishes. The extremely high salt content of military pork, while necessary for preservation, created constant thirst among soldiers and contributed to the enormous quantities of water and coffee consumed by Civil War armies. Confederate soldiers generally received similar salt pork when supplies permitted, though Southern supply difficulties meant that pork rations became increasingly irregular, particularly during the final 2 years of war. Fresh beef, when available, represented a welcome change from salt pork, though it presented different logistical challenges. Both armies employed the practice of driving cattle with moving columns, slaughtering animals as needed to provide fresh meat. This system worked reasonably well during periods of stable encampment or slow-moving campaigns, but proved impractical during rapid marches or active combat operations. The commissary department on both sides contracted with civilian beef suppliers, and substantial herds accompanied major armies. Fresh beef was generally issued as cuts rather than selected steaks or roasts, and soldiers received whatever portion the company cook or quartermaster happened to distribute. The meat was typically boiled in large kettles or roasted over open fires, seasoned with whatever salt and pepper might be available. During summer months, the lack of refrigeration meant that beef had to be consumed quickly after slaughter or would spoil, and soldiers' accounts frequently mention the questionable quality of meat issued during hot weather. The quality of beef supplied to armies varied considerably and became the subject of repeated complaints and occasional scandal. Union contractors sometimes supplied cattle that were diseased, elderly, or undernourished, resulting in tough, unpalatable meat. Confederate armies faced even greater difficulties in beef procurement, as Union forces occupied major cattle-raising regions, and blockade effects reduced imports of preserved meats. By 1864, many Confederate units received beef only sporadically, and when they did, it often came from cattle so emaciated that soldiers described the meat as nearly inedible. Archaeological excavations at Confederate campsites from the later war years have revealed bone remains indicating severe nutritional stress in livestock, corroborating soldiers' complaints in letters and diaries. Coffee deserves particular attention, as perhaps the most psychologically important element of the soldier's diet, particularly in Union forces. Northern soldiers consumed coffee in quantities that appear remarkable by modern standards, with estimates based on commissary records suggesting that Union soldiers drank between 6 and 8 cups daily when supplies permitted. The coffee issued to Union troops came as green, unroasted beans, which soldiers would roast themselves in skillets over campfires, then grind using improvised methods, including rifle butts, rocks, or the few available hand-cranked grinders. The resulting grounds were boiled in water to produce a beverage that soldiers universally praised as essential to maintaining morale and alertness. Coffee became so integral to Union soldier culture that its absence, even temporarily, generated immediate complaints in letters home and diary entries. The ritual of coffee preparation and consumption provided structure to the soldier's day, with coffee consumed at breakfast, dinner, supper, and during guard duty or night watches. Confederate soldiers faced a dramatically different coffee situation. While Confederate ration regulations initially included coffee, the Union naval blockade severely restricted Southern coffee imports by 1862, and by 1863, real coffee had become scarce in Confederate armies. This scarcity led to widespread adoption of coffee substitutes, which soldiers called Confederate coffee or Lincoln coffee, in bitter acknowledgement of its inferior status. These substitutes included roasted chicory root, roasted sweet potatoes, roasted rye, roasted corn, roasted acorns, roasted peanuts, and various other plants subjected to the roasting process in hopes of producing something vaguely coffee-like. Soldiers' accounts make clear that none of these substitutes proved satisfactory. though chicory, which had been used in genuine coffee blends before the war, was considered the least objectionable. The coffee disparity between Union and Confederate forces became so significant that informal truces occasionally developed along picket lines, where Confederate soldiers would trade tobacco, which remained plentiful in the South, for Union coffee. These unofficial exchanges, which officers on both sides attempted to suppress with limited success, demonstrate the high value soldiers placed on coffee. Sugar and salt, while less celebrated than coffee, played crucial roles in making military rations palatable and preserving soldier health. Sugar was issued as either white, refined sugar or brown sugar, depending on availability and contract specifications. Soldiers used sugar primarily to sweeten coffee, though it also went into desserts when time and ingredients permitted. Confederate sugar supply benefited from the South's substantial sugar production in Louisiana, though Union occupation of New Orleans in April 1862 disrupted this source. By war's end, sugar had become scarce in Confederate armies, with molasses and sorghum syrup serving as substitutes when available. Salt proved even more critical, being essential both as seasoning and as preservative for meat. The Confederacy's salt supply situation became desperate after Union forces captured or destroyed major salt works along the coast, leading to a Confederate government program to develop inland salt production. The salt shortage affected not only Army rations, but also civilian ability to preserve food, contributing to nutritional problems throughout the South. Beans constituted an important component of soldier diet, when properly issued and prepared, though soldiers' opinions on beans varied considerably. Navy beans, a white bean variety, were the standard issue, provided either dried or occasionally in limited quantities as fresh beans. Proper preparation of dried beans required extended soaking, followed by prolonged cooking, a process that demanded both time and fuel. In active campaign conditions, when armies moved frequently and cooking time was limited, beans often went unprepared or were inadequately cooked, resulting in hard, indigestible meals that soldiers understandably found unappealing. When armies settled into more permanent camps, beans could be soaked overnight and slow-cooked in large kettles, producing a nutritious, if monotonous, dish. Soldiers often enhanced beans with salt pork, onions when available, and whatever seasonings they could obtain. Confederate bean supply proved less reliable than Union, with shortages becoming common by 1863. Some Confederate units received peas as bean substitutes, following the ration regulations' allowance for this exchange, though soldiers generally found dried peas even less appealing than beans. Vegetables represented a critical gap in the official military ration for both armies, and this deficiency had serious health consequences that became apparent as the war progressed. The official Union ration included desiccated or dried vegetables at the rate of 1 pound and 4 ounces per 100 rations. But this allotment proved both insufficient and unpopular. The desiccated vegetables, produced through an experimental preservation process that compressed dried vegetables into dense cakes, were universally despised by soldiers, who called them desecrated vegetables and assigned them various obscene nicknames. When reconstituted in water, these compressed vegetable cakes produced a slimy, unappetizing mixture that bore little resemblance to fresh vegetables. Despite soldiers' complaints, the desiccated vegetables did contain some nutritional value and likely helped prevent scurvy in some units, though soldiers often refused to eat them even when issued. The absence of adequate fresh vegetables in soldier diet contributed to widespread scurvy and other nutritional deficiency diseases, particularly during winter months when armies were in established camps and depended entirely on issued rations. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, became a significant medical problem in both armies, with symptoms including bleeding gums, loose teeth, weakness, and susceptibility to other diseases. Union medical authorities eventually recognized the scurvy problem and attempted to address it through vegetable supplements, including encouraging soldiers to gather wild plants and establishing vegetable gardens near permanent camps. The Sanitary Commission, a civilian organization supporting Union forces, also distributed vegetables and anti-scorbutics to Army hospitals and, when possible, to combat units. Confederate forces faced even more severe scurvy problems due to less effective supply systems and the general deterioration of Southern agriculture under war conditions. Soldiers on both sides supplemented their official rations through various means, creating an informal food economy that significantly impacted actual nutrition. Foraging, the military term for taking food from civilian sources with or without compensation, became routine practice for both armies, though policies and practices varied. The Union Army officially prohibited unauthorized foraging and required that commissary officers purchase supplies from civilians at fair market prices, but enforcement of these regulations proved inconsistent, and Union soldiers frequently simply took what they wanted, particularly in Confederate territory. The practice intensified during Sherman's March to the Sea in late 1864, when Union forces adopted a deliberate strategy of living off the land and destroying Southern agricultural resources. Confederate forces also foraged extensively, though they faced the complication of taking food from their own civilian population. Official Confederate policy theoretically required payment for impressed supplies, but the Confederate currency's declining value meant that such payments provided little real compensation to civilians. The specific foods obtained through foraging varied by region and season, but commonly included chickens, pigs, sweet potatoes, corn, apples, and other fruits when in season. Soldiers would raid smokehouses for hams and bacon, take stored grain, slaughter livestock, and harvest crops from fields. Letters and diaries reveal that soldiers maintained various attitudes toward foraging, with some expressing guilt about taking food from civilians, particularly poor families, while others viewed it as justified warfare against enemy populations or simply necessary for survival. The moral complexity of foraging becomes apparent in soldiers' writings, where the same individual might condemn foraging in one entry and describe his own foraging expedition in the next. Sutlers, civilian merchants licensed to travel with armies and sell goods to soldiers, provided another source of food supplementation. Sutlers carried items not included in the official ration, including canned goods, cheese, butter, eggs when available, pies, cakes, candies, and various condiments. The quality and pricing of sutler goods generated constant soldier complaints, with many men believing that sutlers charged exorbitant prices for inferior products. Military authorities attempted to regulate sutler prices with limited success, and the relationship between soldiers and sutlers remained generally antagonistic throughout the war. Confederate soldiers had access to sutlers early in the war, but the Southern sutler system largely collapsed by 1863 due to supply disruptions and currency problems. Union sutlers remained active throughout the war, though their stock became more limited during active campaigns when supply wagons could not keep pace with moving columns. Care packages from home, which soldiers called boxes, provided both nutritional supplementation and vital morale support. Families in both North and South sent food to their soldier relatives when postal systems and military mail delivery permitted. These packages typically included items that could survive shipping without refrigeration, such as dried fruits, pickles, preserves, nuts, cakes, cookies, and smoked or cured meats. Soldiers shared box contents with messmates, creating a communal approach to supplemental food that reinforced unit cohesion. The Union's more effective postal system and more developed transportation infrastructure meant that Northern soldiers generally received boxes more reliably than Confederates, though Southern families made determined efforts to send food despite increasing difficulties. By 1864, Confederate mail service had deteriorated significantly, and many Southern soldiers received boxes irregularly or not at all. The actual cooking and consumption of rations involved various levels of organization, depending on whether armies were in camp or on campaign. In established camps, companies often organized into messes of 6 to 8 men who would pool their rations and take turns cooking, or designate one member as regular cook. These messes would maintain a shared skillet, kettle, and basic utensils, with individual soldiers providing their own plates, cups, and eating implements. The company mess system allowed for more elaborate meal preparation and more efficient use of rations than individual cooking. During active campaigns, when armies moved frequently and cooking time was limited, organization broke down, and soldiers often ate individually or in informal small groups, consuming whatever could be prepared quickly or eaten without cooking. The tools and implements used for food preparation reflected both official issue and individual improvisation. Each company received standard cooking equipment, including large kettles, skillets, and basic utensils, transported in company wagons. Individual soldiers carried personal eating equipment, with the standard Union soldiers' kit including a tin cup, tin plate, knife, fork, and spoon, though many soldiers discarded forks as unnecessary and ate with knives and spoons alone. Confederate soldiers often lacked complete eating kits, particularly late in the war, and improvised with whatever implements they could obtain. Canteens for carrying water were official issue for both sides, with Union canteens typically made of tin covered with wool cloth, and Confederate canteens showing greater variety in materials, including wood, tin, and even glass when other materials were unavailable. Water supply and quality significantly impacted soldier health and the preparation of food. Both armies depended heavily on local water sources, including streams, rivers, springs, and wells. Water quality varied enormously, and soldiers frequently consumed water contaminated with human and animal waste, particularly when armies camped near their own or previous encampments. The lack of understanding about waterborne disease transmission meant that few precautions were taken beyond avoiding obviously foul water. Coffee consumption may have provided some health protection, as boiling water for coffee killed pathogens, though this benefit was not understood at the time. Diarrheal diseases caused by contaminated water constituted the leading cause of illness in both armies, with dysentery and chronic diarrhea affecting hundreds of thousands of soldiers and causing more deaths than combat during the war. Seasonal variations affected soldier diet significantly, with winter months generally providing better food supply than summer. During winter, armies typically settled into established camps, where more elaborate cooking facilities could be constructed, and where cold temperatures allowed for better food preservation. Winter camps also facilitated the establishment of vegetable gardens and the construction of more permanent bakeries and kitchens. Summer campaigning meant constant movement, limited cooking opportunities, and the rapid spoilage of fresh foods. The hot weather of southern summers proved particularly challenging for food preservation, with meat and other perishables spoiling quickly. Soldiers' accounts from summer campaigns frequently describe meals of hardtack and coffee only, with hot food preparation impossible due to rapid marching or the presence of enemy forces that made campfire smoke dangerous. The nutritional adequacy of Civil War military rations remains debated among historians, though the evidence suggests that when official rations were fully issued and supplemented with additional food sources, soldiers could maintain reasonable health for limited periods. However, multiple factors prevented full ration distribution with reliability. Supply disruptions caused by enemy action, transportation difficulties, and bureaucratic inefficiency meant that soldiers frequently received less than their official entitlement. Confederate soldiers, in particular, experienced increasingly severe shortages as Union forces disrupted Southern supply lines and occupied agricultural regions. Studies of soldiers' physical condition, based on medical records and physical examinations, suggest that many soldiers, particularly Confederates, suffered from chronic malnutrition by the war's final year. The average weight of Confederate prisoners of war by 1865 indicates significant nutritional deficiency, though determining whether this resulted from inadequate rations disease, or combination of factors, presents methodological challenges. Specific military operations and campaigns created unique food supply situations that illustrate the challenges of military provisioning. The Siege of Vicksburg, from May to July 1863, presents a dramatic example of how military operations could create starvation conditions. Confederate forces defending Vicksburg, surrounded by Union armies and cut off from supply, faced progressive food shortages that eventually led to the consumption of mules, horses, and rats. Contemporary accounts from both Confederate defenders and Union besiegers describe the desperate food situation inside Vicksburg, with soldiers and civilians reduced to eating whatever protein sources they could find. The surrender on July 4, 1863, resulted in part from the complete exhaustion of food supplies, demonstrating how logistics could determine military outcomes independent of combat capability. Sherman's March to the Sea, from November to December 1864, operated on the opposite principle, with Union forces deliberately living off Southern agriculture and destroying what they could not consume. The 60,000 Union soldiers on this campaign received minimal supplies through normal channels and instead foraged extensively, taking livestock, grain, preserved foods, and fresh produce from southern farms and plantations. While this strategy successfully supplied the Union Army, it also created severe food shortages for southern civilians and contributed to agricultural collapse in Georgia. The effectiveness of Sherman's foraging system demonstrated that a well-organized army in productive agricultural territory could sustain itself without conventional supply lines, though at tremendous cost to civilian populations. The dietary experiences of soldiers of different ranks reveal significant disparities. Officers, particularly senior officers, enjoyed substantially better food than enlisted men. Officers could purchase additional food from sutlers or civilian sources using their salaries, which were significantly higher than enlisted pay. Officers' messes, organized among officers of similar rank, pooled resources to purchase better quality food and hire cooks, creating dining arrangements far superior to enlisted meals. Some general officers employed personal cooks and maintained elaborate dining standards even on campaign, hosting dinners that bore little resemblance to enlisted rations. This disparity in food quality based on rank existed in both armies and generated resentment among enlisted soldiers, who frequently commented in letters and diaries about officers' superior rations. Racial aspects of military rations deserve attention, particularly regarding black soldiers in Union service. The United States Colored Troops, formed beginning in 1863, officially received the same rations as white soldiers, but implementation proved uneven. Some black regiments reported receiving inferior quality rations or smaller quantities than white units, though documentation of this discrimination remains incomplete. Black soldiers' letters and testimony to military authorities indicate that food quality varied significantly depending on commanding officers' attitudes and administrative competence. Additionally, black soldiers often faced discrimination in access to sutlers and in foraging opportunities, particularly in border states where local civilian populations' hostility complicated food acquisition. The medical community's understanding of nutrition during the Civil War period reflected mid-19th century nutritional science, which remained primitive by modern standards. Army surgeons recognized that diet affected health and that scurvy resulted from insufficient vegetables, but the concept of vitamins and specific nutritional requirements lay decades in the future. Medical authorities focused primarily on ensuring adequate caloric intake and protein, rather than balanced nutrition, including micronutrients. The prevailing medical theory of the time emphasized miasma theory over germ theory, leading to misconceptions about disease causation and prevention. Despite these limitations, some Union medical officers advocated successfully for dietary improvements, including better vegetable provision and the establishment of special diets for hospital patients. The economic aspects of military provisioning involved enormous expenditures and created opportunities for both legitimate business and corruption. The Union War Department spent hundreds of millions of dollars on food procurement during the war, making military contracts highly sought after by suppliers. The contract system, which involved competitive bidding for supply contracts, theoretically ensured cost efficiency, but also created incentives for fraud. Scandals involving spoiled meat, substandard flour, and short weight deliveries periodically erupted, leading to investigations and reforms. The Confederate Commissary Department faced different challenges, operating with limited hard currency and an inflating paper currency that made procurement increasingly difficult. Confederate commissary officers often resorted to impressment, the forced purchase of supplies at government-set prices, which generated civilian resentment and contributed to declining support for the war effort. The post-war period saw various efforts to document and preserve knowledge of soldier diet experiences, with veterans organizations and early Civil War historians collecting accounts. Veterans themselves contributed to this documentation through memoirs and at reunions, where reminiscences about food shortages and creative cooking became standard topics. These veteran accounts, while valuable, must be evaluated carefully, as they were typically produced decades after events and reflect the selective memory and narrative shaping common to all reminiscence. Archaeological work at Civil War campsites and battlefields beginning in the late 20th century has provided material evidence that both confirms and complicates the documentary record, revealing details about food consumption patterns that participants did not record in writing. The Civil War soldiers' daily diet, examined across the full scope of the conflict, reveals a complex reality far removed from simplified narratives. The gap between official ration policy and actual food availability created a persistent tension that affected soldier health, morale, and military effectiveness. Union soldiers generally enjoyed superior supply compared to Confederates, though Union forces also experienced shortages during active campaigns and in isolated garrisons. Confederate soldiers faced progressively worsening food supply as the war continued, with the final year seeing widespread severe shortages that contributed to desertion and military collapse. Both armies struggled with the fundamental challenge of feeding large forces operating across vast territories with 19th-century transportation and preservation technology. The soldier diet experience encompassed not merely the quantities and types of food consumed, but also the social practices of cooking and eating, the economic transactions of purchasing and foraging, and the physiological consequences of inadequate nutrition. Understanding what Civil War soldiers actually ate requires examining this full range of factors, moving beyond simple lists of rations to consider the complex realities of how 3 million men sustained themselves through 4 years of the most destructive war in American history.